Okay guys, so in this video I'm gonna show you how I implemented history revert or supporting reverting into a previous translation. So let's get into it. So here we have our little localizer application, and as you can see here, if I click this button now, we will have this little modal here, which is basically just going to be a big list of all the different, well, inputs, that the updates that we made to this specific, well, translation for this specific key. So let's say, for the sake of argument, that I want to revert this. I can click here, and then the text actually now changes to being this super long text here. And you can see it's been added as the latest thing. Now I've been a little bit lazy with some of this stuff here, where like formatting dates and stuff like that. I mean, I'm just going to come out and say that if you are making internal tools, it's very, unless you're working for a really, really big company, it's very unlikely that you're going to have much in terms of requirements. I mean, the idea of these internal tools is like, just make it work so that people can use it, because it's not a user-facing thing. Sometimes that's not the best thing, but sometimes it's, it's just right for your project. But I can, I can pretty much click whatever I want here and just click this, and now that's reverted. And if I edit this like that, we expect, yeah, as you can see here, it's actually just adding another one. So let's have a look at that. Well, actually, first, I think the first thing we need to consider here is what's actually coming over the wire. So if I refresh this page now, you will see that our translations are coming over here, and if I open up those translations, you can now see that we have quite a few of them. And that is pretty much the trick right there. So what basically we've done here is that we've added a field for when this was created, and now we're actually appending things as opposed to updating existing translations, and that's how this actually works. So let's have a look at the code. First and foremost, let's just get the basics out of the way. I've made a few updates here to my import. So we have this translation history component, and now we have something we call Dialog and key editor, and we will touch on that as well. So let's have a look here. We see here that we have a new component called translation history, and we still have the key editor. And in our app context, we've added a few things as well. We imported a new interface for translation history. And I see here that I have an unused, I'll remove that import later. But basically on open translation history is a new method that we have, and we have an on-close translation history. And then we have these two fields, which is called selected translation history. And that's going to be either the shape of the interface, or it's going to be undefined. And then we have show translation history. That's pretty much it. And then I can scroll through here, and you can see I made a few small like formatting updates. I mean, this is basically the same thing here. Added a few methods and added these keys to my context value. And down here on open translation history, we're basically just going to go and find the translation that is represented by the passed-in translation ID, and then we're gonna, well, there's a language as well. If we don't find that translation, we're gonna throw an error, and then we're gonna go through all of the translations associated with this, and we're simply going to find the all the translation texts that are associated with the language that is specified, because if I click here, I'm going to see a long list of translations because I have these translations for like that specific language. But if I click here, you'll see that there's actually nothing here because I've never actually updated this value to anything. And that's about it really. And then we have like a close functionality that's just going to unset our state and close that modal. Now, what is Dialog? Well, Dialog is basically a bit of a, well, this is me optimizing things a little bit, because I realized that the translation for like the dialog box that I have that represents this, you may recognize this, that's very similar to something else we have. This component, well, that is pretty much it. This component is extremely similar to, like, they're basically the same thing, right? So I thought, let's be a little bit proactive here and extract the common functionality into a a separate component that then we can reuse and share some of that code. And this is generally the way that you want to go about making generic components. You need to figure out, first you build something that is specific, and then you figure out that, oh yeah, this is actually something that is going, like you get another situation where you're going to build something that is almost the same thing. And then you can start thinking about extracting that into something more generic. And this is exactly that. So my dialog thing here is basically just going to be this background and the onClick handler. And then we're going to pass in the children. And then I have a dialog footer specified. We can actually look at that these files here. And let's see, a dialog footer. So this is the footer of my dialog, which is just going to be this thing here. And then I pass in the tab index and submit button text so that I can actually specify what this button should represent. Now, it doesn't take a click handler or anything like that because I don't actually need it to do that. I might add a click handler in the future, but that's anyway how it works right now. The dialog header is very similar component, like it's just the header of this component. So I pass in a non-close, like this thing here, so I can close it. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Hopefully this makes sense. And then I've created this dialog CSS, where basically all the stuff that was in the key editor, you'll just look at you see that I've kind of stripped out everything that was specific to these parts of the key editor and put them in here instead with a new namespace, because now this component is no longer named key editor. And then I have this index.tsx file, which is a pattern that I like to use, where basically the idea that I go for here is that, alright, so I have this directory, which is a module for me, and it simply contains all the stuff that is related to a dialog. And then I extract all the components into their separate files, and if I have more than one component, I put them in an index.tsx file so that I give the consumer of my little package here the option to either pull in everything and destructure it out, or to pull in one specific file. And yeah, that should be that. And then the key editor here has seen a few updates as well, where, as you can see here, I mean, I just added this, we were including the dialog footer, and the dialog header. And down here we used to have tons and tons and tons of markup, as you can see here now, but now it's actually a little bit cleaner, where, right, so the dialog component takes in the show editor boolean that's going to show whether or not, we're either going to render this component or we're not. And then we pass in the noun close, then we specify the dialog header. We're not passing in, like as you can see, we're defining our own form and things of this nature, because we actually want the behavior of the content within this modal or this dialog to be a bit different. So that's why we're not just creating a super component that simply takes in some type of content and that's it, because this form is still critical for us to be able to submit the key editor in the same fashion we did earlier. So we're just basically moving the common features into their separate components and still keeping everything that is needed by each individual component the way it was. And the dialog header takes in a title and the onClose, and as you can see here, the key editor form fields are still the same. Dialog footer takes in a tab index, and the submit button text is going to be save. And yeah, that's pretty much it, really. So it's basically just a refactor. We're simply stripping the code that's going to be reused in our translation history and moving it somewhere else. Cool. So key editor form fields, just a small improvement here. Changed this to a div instead. And well, we already saw this. Like, it's basically just stripping stuff out. Languages.tsx has been updated as well, because I needed to do a little bit of filtering logic now, since we basically have, well, in order for us to be able to show the correct information regarding to like translation keys, we want to be able to actually specify whether or not a key is like this number here, these translations here. In order to show that in a correct manner, we needed to basically just extract some of these functions into common feature. A common feature, we'll see that in just a moment. But so I thought to myself, I'll just move that into a separate package that actually, or rather move them into named functions and do it that way, instead of having this thing here where I basically just use a lambda function. So I added a translation history interface, which was what we saw earlier, and that's basically what we're going to pass into our new translation history dialog. And basically what we need is the ID and all the translations themselves. And the reason why we need both, we'll touch on that in just a moment. So here's our new component, and basically all we're going to do is that we're going to bind our methods, and here in our render function, we're simply going to check, do we have a selected translation history, because remember, this is an optional. And then we're going to try to extract out all the translations, and then here's our dialog, and you recognize this since before, and we check whether or not we should render this dialog, and then we have our onClose, and once again we have a form with an onSubmit and all that good stuff. Then we have the dialog header, and here is our list that we're simply going to render out. And here you can see that we're actually these are the functions that we actually needed to be able to use. That was common to the previous code in the language.tsx file. So basically that's why I've moved them out. And then we simply map over all of these. And what we're going to do is that we're going to check if we have the first element. If we have the first element, we're going to set show revert to false, and otherwise we're going to set it to true. And then, yeah, we're basically just going to render this out with some properties. We'll look inside of this component just in a moment. And here is our dialog footer with the text done. And here is on revert, where basically we're going to pass in the translation text for whichever element we clicked in our little list here, and then we're going to check if we have a history, or well, if it is defined as because it's an optional, we're going to update the translation text with the specified translation ID and that text, get all the translations, set them, and then close this dialog. So basically we're just updating a translation text as we would when we actually type into this box. But we're just doing it without actually any typing. We're simply extracting this value and creating another instance of this record. So that's kind of how this works. So we just append new, whenever we update, we simply append a new thing. And here's on close and on submit, small tiny little things here. And then we wrap this with the app context so that we actually have access to the context. And here is our translation history row, and here you can see our interfaces being passed in. We have a little onClick function here, and here is the actual list item where, alright, we're simply going to check if we want to show the revert button or not. And if we want to show it, we're simply going to render out the badge button with the onClick handler, which is this thing here, which is going to call onRevert. And then we have our tab index, and then we add in the variant to this badge button because we wanted it to be, well, actually this is just arbitrary. I just thought that it's nice that, alright, all these buttons have one color, and then hey, the done button is a little bit special. Well, that's about it really. And here we extract out our values, and yeah, that's about it. Here is the CSS for this, nothing super fancy. And for our translation value list, we've added something. I've changed this slightly, so instead of just calling it sort, I call it sort by language now. And here is once again these methods for just sorting, filtering, and sorting our lists. So we get the right sequence. And basically, the reason why I have this sort by created at is because when I then filter unique translations, I'm basically, because that's an exhaustive filter, which means that if the list is out of order, I'm not going to get the most recent content, because remember, we have added in the concept of the date now, which means that we need to sort our list first so that everything comes in the correct sequence. So the most recent record is always at the top. And then when we filter, we can always be sure that we're just going to keep the stuff that is most relevant and filter out everything that comes afterwards. But if we just filter immediately, we might get old records as the top choice, and that's not what we want. We want to sort things first. And then we sort by language, and then we display them so that we're always sure that these two things come in the correct order. And yeah, translation value row, that's the next component, and I've changed that just slightly as well here, so you can see now that, alright, so this onClick method now actually does something instead of just being a empty button, and all that's going to do is that it's going to call my own open translation history, and that's going to pass in the translation ID and the language that we have here. And then of course we wrap that with an app context so we have access to the context. Few small arbitrary changes here to my CSS, and tag filtering dropdown. Yeah, basically I just changed this because I noticed that I had a few duplicate records, so this is just a small bug fix that I added in. It's not ideal to use like the index, but you know, it's not super important, so I went that way anyway. Translation API, small change here. I've just updated, removed some unused imports. And here for our client-side model of a translation text, we've added this created at, as you saw earlier, and that's as I hope that is clear to you. The reason we have it is so that we can actually know, like this, to make a distinction when something is like the most recent thing, because we want this to be at the top, and then everything else kind of follows in sequence. And then basically, well, we added this little get created at method because when we actually send something over the wire, the thing that we're actually going to get is a, if we look at that just quickly, what you're going to get over the wire is this. You're going to get a string, but we want that to be a date when we're actually like a proper JavaScript object date or a date object. So basically what we want to do here is that we're going to get whatever's coming in, and then we are going to just call that an any, and then we're going to try to parse that into a date. And if we can't, we're simply going to throw an error, log out an error, and return a new date. Otherwise we'll return it as it is. That's enough validation for now. And here are, well, basically the functions, the implementations of the methods that we saw earlier in order to filter first and foremost based on when something was created, then get everything that is unique, and then check whether or not it has a value. Because one thing that well, I can actually show you that. So let's say that I did this. I empty that. Now if I go and click here, you notice that there is no empty record because I didn't think that that made any sense. So this list is actually just going to show the actual like records. I still create it though, so if I do that, we actually get another record. And sort by created at, pretty a simple sort that is going to look at the created at date. And has text is just a filter function that checks whether or not the text value is a truthy value. And for a unique translation text, it's fairly straightforward, I hope. Basically what we're going to do is that we're going to pass this into a method, like just as a function to the filtering function, or the filter function. And that's going to give us three values: a translation, a text, an index, and a reference to the actual array. And then we're simply going to map over, grab out the languages, and then we're going to get the index of the specified language. And we're going to check whether or not that language is actually the same index, which means that this is going to return truthy if we are the first element in that array. And then it's simply going to exclude everything if there's something behind after. And that's pretty much it. Because the first thing that we're going to find in the array, if we are on item the first item in the list, and this actually returns truthy, if the second item is the same thing, if that's the same language, the index is going to once again reference the first item, which means that the index we are on currently is not going to be the same, so it's going to return falsy. That may be a little bit tricky to understand, but hopefully it makes sense. Translated text on the server has updated as well, and basically I've just added a length for the text because I wanted to try out with more text. And then I added just the date field for creating, well, created at. So when we create a translated text, we simply set the date with the getter and setter. And in our translations here, small update where, well, I just wanted to change this from add translations to, well, update translation to add translation because it makes more semantic, it's more semantically correct. And as you can see now, we're no longer actually going through the list and finding the specific element, then just updating that element's list or setting the text of that translated text. Now we're simply appending things. So our code became a little bit easier as well to handle on the server at least. And then on our translation controller, small change here where, well, basically we well, we extract out the translation here. We create our new update or our new translated text by just extracting out the value that we're sending, because remember, what we're actually we're sending an actual already existing translated translation text, or like an entity, to the server, but we don't want to we can't just put that into the database, because the database is going to complain that it already has an element that references this. So what we want is to just extract the information that is inside of this entity and put that into a new translated text type. So we're extracting out the text and the language and simply updating or adding another translation to our list of translations. And the same thing goes for here. And yeah, hopefully that made sense. So we will call this pretty much done now. And now we're going to have a look at logins and stuff of this nature to have a little bit of access restriction to our application. So so that some people with a given role can actually update things and add new translations, and some people can simply check what's in our application.